should read more. I mean, this is honestly my excuse, or my my way to get myself to actually read more, because I haven't read like a book in, God forbid, years. So this helps. This helps me a little bit. I'm honestly still very impressed with myself. Like I said at the very beginning of this, I feel like I have a talent for sight reading. I have never read any of these before, and I'm still like, I swear to God, it's like Dance Dance Revolution. Just hitting the stuff. It's like a rhythm game is what it feels like. Like just riding the wave of all the commands that are coming and all the inputs that need to be set. God, I love this. Okay. Episode 2, Sand in the Hourglass by Langley Hyde. Time trickled away more slowly than the grains of sand settling between the rocks. The fine particles sifted into Karn's joints. He didn't know how long he had lain there, pinned in the dark. Was it days or weeks that had passed? What if months had flown away like a small and startled bird? What if it was longer? Years? Decades? Eons? No, he could not think of it. No one would miss him. No one would know where he had gone. No one knew where he had gone. He should have told someone. He should have at least told Joyra or Jaya. If he had told them, they would have known where to search and either freed him or seen the Phyrexians themselves. What if the Phyrexians were the ones to find him? Would it be worse if no one found him? He might wait alone, forever in the darkness, in the silence. Sand trickled down. A scrabbling noise. Maybe claws grating on rough stone. A weight lifted away from his hand, exposing it to the chill air currents. He could move his fingers. Relief shot through him, a pang more powerful than the blind eternities. He stretched his fingers, marveling at the freedom of this small movement. The ability to make any movement. Something warm and soft touched his fingertips, organic, impenetrable to his senses. Not Phyrexian. Gentle, thoughtful. He was found. The warmth left his fingertips. Had his rescuer departed? Scratching quickened. Rocks grated. Pebbles cascaded. Clunks as large rocks tossed away landed. The burden on him lightened. Karn strained. The material around him budged, shifting at the pressure of his enormous strength. Karn exercised the powerful mechanisms in his torso, pushing himself upright. Rocks poured away. He heaved himself up slowly. He wanted to take care not to hurt his rescuer with any stray stones. As his efforts increased, the scratching noises faded. The scratching noise ended. Footfalls retreated as his rescuer stepped clear. Karn would have to trust that they had moved to a safe distance. Karn hauled himself to his feet. Stone poured off him, and he was free. The warm air caressed his body. He rolled his shoulders, reveling in their movement. The tumbling rock kicked up a gray haze. He shook the fine particles from his body and wiped clean his eyes. Ajani stood in the tunnel, his fur a striking white in the torchlight. The pupil of his unscarred, pale blue eye glinted with the nocturnal hue of a nighttime predator. His shoulders had a proud set to them, like he was pleased he'd found Karn. He granted Karn a friendly, close-lipped smile. Karn nodded, tentative. He'd only met Ajani a few times. For Ajani's species, baring teeth was a hostile action, so this small smile was friendlier than a broad human grin. "How did you find me?" Karn cleared his throat. It, too, felt dusty. The mechanism inside it clicked uncomfortably. "I told no one I was here." Ajani coughed, awkward, deep in his chest. "After you didn't answer the letters, Joyra became worried about you. She asked Raph to place a tracking spell on the letters, one that would only activate when you, and only you, opened the envelope. That's how I located your camp." Karn stilled, embarrassed. Had Joyra known every time he'd read a letter and left it unanswered? Every time he'd pushed aside the paper heaps on his worktop to make room for a new project? Had Ajani seen the chaotic clutter that populated his workspace? Karn would have never let his camp descend in such a state if he'd expected a visitor. He evaded Ajani's gaze and investigated the joints in his body for damage. Ah, the spearhead. He'd forgotten he'd left that lodged in him. Every time you moved the letters, Joyra knew you were alive, Ajani said, and didn't want to talk. She was determined to give you the time you needed, and not to press you. She knows how private you can be when you are upset. Karn worked at the spearhead, trying to remove it from his body. The rockfall had jammed it even deeper into him. But when you stopped shuffling the letters around, Ajani continued, she grew concerned. And here I am. Karn grunted. He wiggled the spearhead back and forth, trying to loosen it from between his torso plates. His blunt fingers, though capable of the most detailed work, couldn't dig deep enough. He still couldn't believe Joyra had known how often he looked at those letters, considered replying, and then set them aside. Too many times. Joyra as well? She's in her workshop on the mana rig, Ajani shrugged. And the weatherlight? She returned the weatherlight to its rightful owner, Ajani said. Shauna captains it. Ah, good. Shauna will rise to the task. Karn had served with Sisay and was pleased to see the airship in her descendant's hands. Do you mind if I... Ajani nodded at the spear point. Karn shrugged. I'm sorry, I was trying to figure out if the do you mind if I was Ajani speaking or Karn speaking, but I'm pretty sure based on like context, whatever. Karn shrugged. Ajani was not as tall as Karn, but he was tall enough that he had to bend his head to inspect the spearhead. He inserted his claws into Karn's joints with surprising delicacy. You know, every planeswalker goes through phases like this. We withdraw, especially if we have played a role in changing a plane's fate. I have seen it time and time again. After a great hunt, you feast and you sleep. It's natural, and there is no shame in that. I do not feast, and I do not sleep, Karn said. That does not mean you don't need to recuperate. Ajani eased the spearhead from Karn's body. Karn had never been permitted to recuperate when Urza had loosed him as a war machine. Urza had explained it was unnecessary and indifferent to Karn's weariness. Urza had explained it was unnecessary and indifferent to Karn's weariness, had turned his attention to other, more interesting projects. Ajani examined the spear point. Its metal glimmered a sickly green in the dimness. You encountered more than a rockfall. What happened here, my friend? Karn didn't wish to answer the question. Not until he knew whether he could trust Ajani. The vision he'd had upon touching Sheoldred still thrummed within him. Phyrexian agents everywhere, hidden across Dominaria, waiting. How long have I been buried? A few months, Ajani admitted. It took time to locate you. Months lost. Months that could have been spent preparing. Sheoldred's segmented parts had skittered along his paralyzed arms, down his back, spider-like. They had poured over him. He would have had ample time to reassemble she would have had ample time to reassemble herself. Rona as well, he was sure. You have damaged yourself. Karn nodded at Ajani, whose claw had torn at the cuticle, a wound that had most likely occurred when he had dug Karn out from the rock slide. Let us return to my camp for supplies. I must also check the sensitive equipment there to verify that it is still functional. Karn did not voice what he feared most. Did he still have the Silex and the clay tablet? Whew. In the months Karn had been buried, his campsite had remained undisturbed, but not unchanged. The small tents had gone dingy with mildew. Ajani hunched his shoulders. He had a planeswalker's distaste for these caves. Even if one could not directly sense the interplanar technologies, their way of warping time made the space claustrophobic. No, Bixby, shut up! Thank you. Karn too could feel the pressure. Karn led Ajani through his cluttered camp, then ducked into his main tent. The box holding the Silex and the tablet remained where he'd left it and appeared to be locked. Karn ignored it, conscious of Ajani's eyes on him. Karn located a barrel with water, potable, though he normally used it for cleaning purposes, and a rag. He handed the rag to Ajani to wash and wrap his wound.
Why were you here? Excuse me, oh my god. Why were you here, Karn?
Ajani rinsed his hand, working out the grit that had lodged in his wound. Karn inventoried his equipment for damage as he replied,
Searching for artifacts. Due to the unique properties of the caves of Koilos, not even the most entrepreneurial archaeologists or enthusiastic researchers have plundered them.
He made his way in a circuit around the tent, toward the box where he'd hidden the Silex in its tablet, casually. The box seemed intact, but he dared not open it. He reached out with his special senses. The tablet felt like mere clay, a combination of aluminum, silicon, magnesium, sodium, and other trace elements. The Silex buzzed at him, present but indecipherable due to its powerful magic. Karn set the box aside. He faced Ajani and related all he had seen.
Sheoldred escaped?
Ajani paced in the tent's confines.
Karn, we must warn. I have tried,
Karn said.
Many times.
Now you have seen Sheoldred. Karn wished he could trust Ajani, but he shook his head.
The caves where I discovered the Phyrexian staging ground are no longer accessible. I have no proof that the Phyrexians have returned to Dominaria.
Don't we? Ajani held out the spearhead.
Karn, there is a peace summit between the Keldans and the Benalish. If any nations will take the Phyrexian return seriously, it's those two. I propose we speak to their leaders.
Ajani was right. Of all the nations in Dominaria, Keld and New Benalia were likeliest to listen to Karn's warning. Rada, the leader of the Keldans, had reforged that rugged nation of warriors into a devastating military force. Aaron Capetian led New Benalia's knights, whose passion for justice made each one worth a dozen fighters.
Let me gather my finds and sensitive equipment before we go.
Ajani tapped an amulet hanging from his belt.
Joyra gave me a summoning device for the Weatherlight before she sent me. Shana will honor it. The Weatherlight may be a speedy ship, but she is not quick enough.
Karn stacked several pieces on the chest that held the Silex and the tablet and loaded everything into a rucksack.
I propose that we planeswalk.
Karn did not know how other planeswalkers perceived the blind eternities, but to him the interminable space felt like crushed velvet, its lukewarm prickles sometimes verging on pain. The vertigo plunging through Karn contrasted with the sense that he wasn't moving at all, which was at odds with the feeling that he pulled himself along a cord to an unknown destination. He burst through like a silken gash into cool air. Karn stood knee-deep in wild grasses, orange poppies, and purple flowering thistles. Inland the farms seemed young, recently cleared land holding fields yellow with blooming canola. The homesteads bled into mountains, the misty, temperate rainforest punctuated with emerald alpine meadows. If he had been human, he would have taken a single shuddering breath. To his other side, a large stone statue protected a seaport whose buildings and streets were carved into white chalk cliffs. Eons ago, a Phyrexian mortal ship must have decapitated the statue, and the decrepit hulk lay atop the statue's neck. Overgrown with honeysuckle, it shadowed the city's colorful awnings. In the center of the bay, a worn, smooth island protruded from the water, the statue's head now home to seabirds. Ajani led Karn down narrow paths past modest homes carved into the chalk. These seemed small and well-worn in contrast to the newly sculpted city hall, which had large but chunky dimensions, wide windows and balconies framed with ornate columns.
Do you know where the peace talks are occurring?
Karn asked. Ajani paused and cocked his head.
Follow the sound of arguing, I suppose.
Karn could hear nothing. The Leonin senses had to be spectacular. And now the brain is starting to need to catch up. Processing power is failing. Ajani led Karn through a grand but empty reception area, then up a narrow set of stairs. The corridors linking the rooms felt claustrophobic, lit only by torches. They pushed between brass-bound double doors into a light-filled room dominated by a long granite table. A broad balcony overlooked the sea and a male varied thrush, orange beast with a black collar, black mask, and black cap, a beautiful creature, perched on its railing. To one side sat the representatives of House Capetian of Benalia. The nobleman at the table, Aaron Capetian, a middle-aged man with light ochre skin, had a proud tower with seven colored windows embroidered onto his silks. The knights arrayed behind him, their silver armor chased with gold, their stained glass shields held at the ready, possessed the same gilded motif on their breastplates. God, I love the art for everything Benalish. It's like the stained glass motif is just fascinating, beautiful, gorgeous. To the other side lounged the large gray-skinned Keldon warriors with their heavy leather armor and their heavier weapons. Their warlord, Rada, sat opposite the Capetian nobleman. She had a Keldon's ash-colored skin, black mane, and bulky muscles, but the pointed ears and blue markings of a Skyshroud elf. Other officials, led by a man from New Argive, who had fair skin and a black goatee, lined the sides of the granite negotiation table between the two conflicting parties. Ajani and Karn must have arrived as the negotiations were set to begin, because only a moment later both Joda and Jaya arrived. Joda portaled in, stepping through a door, his magic sliced into the air. His office cluttered with books and bric-a-brac, vanished when the portal slid closed. Jaya planeswalked into the room, appearing with a flash and the smell of charcoal. "It's been a while, old man." Jaya gave Joda a friendly embrace. With his boyish features and shaggy brunette hair, Joda could have been Jaya's grandson, even though he was thousands of years her senior. "Come for the family silver?" "Oh, there's nothing silver here that I like enough to keep, except for my hair. I've already checked your pockets." "Thought about taking up lint farming?" Joda smiled. "I'm not worried. Your tongue is quicker than your fingertips." Jaya's gaze fell on Karn and Ajani. "Well, this is a surprise. Are you two here to work on the negotiations as well?" Ajani regarded Jaya solemn.
"We must speak to you regarding what Karn has seen in the caves of Koilos. The Phyrexians have returned to Dominaria."
The idle small talk at the negotiation table dropped into shocked silence. Joda and Jaya exchanged looks, then turned their attention to Karn. The Keldons, Benalish, and Argivians broke into argument, the overlapping dialects and accents turning their fears into babble. Only the Benalish knights remained at their posts, their rigid posture a testament to their discipline. Jaya had paled. "It hardly seems possible." "I have walked this plane for millennia," Joda said, "and I have read the stories, examined the histories. I have visited the ruins. I tell you this not to boast, but so that you know I speak the truth. The Phyrexians cannot traverse the blind eternities."
"Sheoldred has traveled between planes,"
Karn said. "Only planeswalkers can do that now." Joda pinched the bridge of his nose. "If I recall, Karn, that is a reality you helped usher in." His age, similar to Urza's when Urza had created Karn, overrode his young features with exhaustion. Starting to hit the throat. Karn could not believe Joda would deny the truth. Not when Karn had seen Sheoldred. Perhaps most Phyrexians could not survive the journey through the blind eternities, but Sheoldred had. Even if it had burned away her organic materials, even if it had damaged and weakened her, somehow she had succeeded. Aaron Capetian stood and paced. He seemed agitated. "The Phyrexians are ancient history. I cannot see what you would have gained by asserting this."
"I located a staging ground for a new invasion," Karn said, "led by one of New Phyrexia's leaders, a praetor named Sheoldred. The Society of Mishra serves her, and the Phyrexians are completing dozens of ordinary citizens. We cannot know how many Phyrexians are stationed throughout Dominaria's nations. They may even be among us now."
Have I not been warning you of this? The young nobleman from Argive stood. Based on his gold-embroidered and fur-lined finery, he had to be an important official. Phyrexian sleeper agents will permeate every layer of society if we do not act now. For all we know, they already have. Sten, your alarmist tendencies are not helping, Joda said. Karn, where are the Phyrexians now? The varied thrush fixed a beady eye on him as if curious about his answer. Karn did not have an answer.
They evacuated while I was incapacitated. I do not know.
Joda sighed. The diplomatic situation is too sensitive to halt negotiations now. If you knew where they were, this would be a different matter, but without stronger information, like a location, how could we act to root them out? And even if the Phyrexians were on Dominaria, Jaya said, historically they've divided before they conquer. If we leave this conflict between Benalia and the Keldans unresolved, we play right into their hands. The thrush hopped along the railing. Karn, are you listening to me? Joda asked. Karn returned his attention to Joda. He placed the spearhead on the table.
I am.
I have seen weapons from the Society of Mishra before, Joda said mild.
When has Karn ever lied? Ajani growled. If he says he saw Sheoldred completing people, then we are in danger.
I believe you, Aaron said, but I cannot send my soldiers chasing whispers and rumors across Dominaria. Between the hostilities with the Keldans and fighting off the Cabal's resurgence, I don't have the fighters. His troops have the same engagements as mine, Rada laughed a short bark. I suppose we have found common ground in that. Joda glanced between Rada and Aaron. The Phyrexians haven't been a threat for centuries. I know that your memory is long, Karn, as is mine. If we address today's issue, the conflict between the Capetians and the Keldans, we can then discuss redeploying those same soldiers to fight the Phyrexians. So many people had screamed in Sheoldred's lair, their voices thin and their pain sharp beneath the ecstatic orisons to her glory.
What of the lives Sheoldred now takes?
Joda placed his hand on Karn's shoulder. We may not be talking about something as grand as an interplanar invasion, but lives are being lost to this conflict. They matter too. We will go with you, Karn, Jaya said. We will search for them. But now, let us focus on the task at hand. Karn could feel the room's attention swing back to the table and the negotiations. The thrush flew away. Sten, Jaya said, have someone show Karn and Najani to the guest quarters. Yeah, it's going to be the last story for today, but, I'll continue with the map making. Not to say I'm ending here. I'm not ending here. Oh boy. Probably around 4, I'll call it. So, half an hour-ish. Or call it for the story, I mean. Karn's room was simple. Its furniture basic, but well crafted. A bed, a large table with 2 chairs, and a washstand with a porcelain basin in it. Karn pushed the bed to one side and moved the table into the room's center. He unloaded his backpack, taking care to ensure the Silex, still in its case, was secure.
The most coherent argument Joda and Jaya had against assisting us,
Karn said,
was that we do not know where the Phyrexians are. If we can determine their location, then we will be able to persuade Joda and Jaya to help. And perhaps the others as well.
Ajani paused, his powerful body coiled.
How? A scrying device.
Karn lifted his hand above the tabletop. He generated first the viewing plane, a copper sheet covered in crystal. He filled the narrow layer between the 2 materials with liquid. The device's remainder, a complex assemblage of mechanical parts, required his concentration. His body buzzed with the magic coursing through him. Ajani watched him, the pale blue of his unscarred eye attentive.
What is that? It is for viewing remote locations,
Karn let pride seep into his voice. He'd developed the plan for it himself, and he knew of no other device that could perform similarly. Karn focused on Joyra, not on her face, not on her physical presence, but on her essence, the qualities that made her Joyra. How she always saw through a person's circumstances to their essence. How she was willing to give everyone the benefit of a doubt. The mana rig resolved within the crystal. At first fuzzy, the image filled with depth, then color. Perched upon a cliff's edge in Shiv's brutal desert, the metal structure had the size and complexity of a small city. The image tightened into a single location, a workshop with Joyra in it. She sat at a workbench, her head bent, bronze hair bound and falling between her shoulder blades. She flipped a disconnected toggle back and forth as if thinking.
Can you view Sheoldred?
Ajani asked. All too easily, Karn could visualize Sheoldred, her humanoid torso rising from her scorpion-like body, her voice intimate and resonant inside his head. Karn, such plans. The scryer's image dissolved into mistiness. Karn leaned back on his heels. Ajani glanced at Karn.
They must have protections in place to prevent us from scrying them. A sensible precaution,
unfortunately. Ajani pulled the amulet from his belt that could summon the weatherlight. He placed it in Karn's palm.
You'll need this.
Karn examined the amulet. It seemed a straightforward device.
I can twin this.
Ajani smiled, his lips closed.
Even better.
Karn extended his senses into the amulet. He reproduced it, the metal coiling up from his fingertips to form an identical amulet. Ajani clipped the original to his belt while Karn manufactured a chain for his copy. Karn hung the amulet from his neck, feeling odd about the adornment. Normally he eschewed such things. A varied thrush perched on Karn's windowsill behind Ajani's shoulder. If Karn could draw the Phyrexians out, he would not need to find them. He'd know where they were. The Phyrexians wanted to neutralize Dominari's most powerful weapons. That included the Silex. He would use news of its presence to lure them into the open. But first he had to hide the Silex somewhere safe.
Perhaps if we could speak to Jaya alone,
Ajani suggested,
we could persuade her. She's no diplomat at heart.
Karn stared at the buried thrush. So still, so attentive.
Perhaps.
Oh boy. How long do people usually go when recording narrations? I've heard they go for like 4-hour sessions sometimes. My god. The endurance. Karn let himself into negotiations. Sten was setting an inkwell on the granite table as Joda and Jaya gave both Radha and Aaron Capession quill pens. He did not wish to interrupt before they signed. The sea breeze poured over the balcony, cool with springtime's edge.
You are an impressive leader, Aaron said. I am proud to enter this new era with you.
Radha smiled. You do like to talk fancy.
And you like to be mistaken for a brute, Aaron Capession said. Anyone who takes you for a simple warrior must soon regret it.
Joda smiled. Radha, Aaron will bring his agreement to the other houses to present for ratification. I will accompany him to ensure that this process is accomplished within the next few months, during which all hostilities in the Ice Rime Hills will cease. Radha put up her hands, conceding. Yes, the sacred sites aren't worth any more war, no matter what artifacts they might contain. A breeze stirred the room as a pale blue bead of light formed midair. The light whirled outward into a disk that brightened into azure as Teferi stepped through the vortex. He'd aged well. His shoulders had broadened with middle age, gray threaded his hair, and his umber skin had health's warm blush to it.
Another planeswalker?
Aaron sat back in his chair, exasperated. It must be a sign of interesting times, Radha said. Joda stood. What's happened? It's the Phyrexians. They were on Kamigawa. Teferi closed his eyes and shook his head. Given what Kaya told me of what she saw on Kaldheim. They can travel between planes, Jaya said, lips drawn tight. After a moment, Joda said, "That is alarming to say the least." Had not Karn explained this to both Jaya and Joda? He had seen this with his own eyes. He felt Sheoldred's touch on his body, in his mind. Yet Teferi had arrived bearing secondhand news, and Joda and Jaya believed his assertions? Where were their requests for proof of location now? Karn might as well have been a statue for all the regard they had given him, and the threat Teferi had warned them of wasn't even on Dominaria. But none of that mattered. Only one fact remained relevant.
If the Phyrexians have traveled between multiple planes, then their invasion plans are much more widespread and well coordinated than we anticipated.
Rada tensed. Then we must fight! Aaron shook his head. His knights seemed restless, hands twitching toward their swords as if they expected to launch into action. I never would have thought I'd live to see another Phyrexian invasion. The true twilight has come, one of Rada's warriors hissed. How can we battle such creatures? However bad it is, Sten said, what will come is worse. Joda gave Jaya his calmest help me expression. Jaya flapped her hand at Karn and Ajani as if asking them to remove Teferi, the origin of this disruption. Rada and Aaron had not signed, and this made it seem like they wouldn't. Joda looked like he'd bitten down on a charged piece of aluminum. I have the feeling that my timing was less than immaculate, Teferi said. You don't say, Jaya said and gave them a meaningful look.
I am not certain about this mutual protection clause,
Aaron began. It might be best to look to our own shores, our own peoples, Rada said. Karn ushered Teferi away toward the door. Teferi led him. Diplomacy. Politics, rather. As Planeswalking had exhausted Teferi, Karn, and Ajani... Jesus. Frickin' Oxford commas. As Planeswalking had exhausted Teferi, Karn and Ajani led him to the suite adjacent to theirs. Outside, spring rain pattered down against the cliffside. The rosemary plants growing from cracks in the stone scented the air that wafted through the unglazed windows. Did Rosemary's scent please Karn because he liked it? Or because Urza had designed him to like it? Karn would never know. Teferi always made Karn consider his origins. Not always comfortably.
How is Niambi?
Karn asked. She's providing medical aid to the nomadic tribes in Jamura. Teferi's pride in his daughter radiated from him. And Joyra?
I have not spoken to Joyra in some time.
Karn wished that Urza had made his face with a human's mobility and its subtlety in micro-expressions that it would be easier for him to signal to Teferi that he did not wish to speak about this. Ajani glanced between Teferi and Karn as if the awkward silence stretching between them were visible, a piece of string tight enough to twang.
Something is troubling you.
I did not wish to say this before the Keldans and Benalish, Teferi admitted. But they took Tamio. Even planeswalkers might be vulnerable to them now. We waited too long, Ajani. Ajani froze, shock plain across his face.
Tamio.
Teferi nodded wearily. We can discuss it after I've gotten some rest. Karn watched as Ajani's fingers, her hands curled into tight fists, anger and sorrow crossing his friend's face. He hadn't known they were close.
I should rest as well,
said the Leonin after a moment. Karn accepted this as his cue to depart. Back in his room, he opened the case with the Silex and the tablet in it. He removed the tablet, relocked the case, and set it on the table. He'd keep this here to research it, but the Silex, that he needed to rehome. Somewhere safe, and he knew just the place. Karn pressed his palms to the scryer's crystal-covered copper. Joyra's image appeared. She was no longer in her workshop, but sleeping, her face crunched into her pillow, her reddish-brown hair lying in a messy braid across one cheek. Karn let her image fade. Evading the Oyster Bay guards was simple. The people here may have once made great pirates, but they had not adopted the organized banality of guard duty. Karn, large in the shadows, avoided any light that would glint from his body. He slipped through the town's carved streets, sticking to the darkness, up and around to the top of the cliff. He hiked along the Phyrexian portal ship's spine, its degraded metal softened with wildflowers like purple asters and goldenrod, toward a hill blanketed in young vine maples. Ferns rustled at Karn's shins, and the damp air condensed on his body. Now a sufficient distance to avoid tweaking Jaya and Joda's senses, Karn stepped through the searing blind eternities, tearing a wound in it. Excuse me. The edges fluttered against his body. He passed through it to Shiv and the mana rig, straight into Joyra's workshop. It held a breathless silence, like every instrument in it waited for Joyra to wake. Karn located a supply closet. He stowed the Silex and its case on the lowest shelf behind lengths of pipe whose dust promised that Joyra had not needed them recently. He generated 2 devices, one alarm that would register if the pipes moved, and another weight-sensitive alarm that would notify him if anyone moved the box itself. There. The Silex was safe. Or as safe as it could be. Karn stepped back into the blind eternities. Oh, that's the Silex. Oh! If memory serves from lore stuff, this thing can basically annihilate a plane. Yeah. Back on the forest hill, Karn wound his way downhill toward Oyster Bay. There we go. A light glimmered between the pale, slender-trunked birch trees. A silhouetted person held aloft a lamp. Karn paused, but the lamp had glinted from his body. He had been seen. The figure moved closer. Sten, the new Argivian noble from the negotiation table. A nightjar called, its low warble traveling between the trees. What if his precautions had not been enough? Out for a walk? Sten called.
Yes,
Karn said.
I do not sleep. You are awake late?
No, up early. As Stone neared, his features grew clearer, his beard was trimmed and his hair tidy. Dawn is the only time I truly feel safe, at peace. With the smell of with the smell of baking bread wafting over the city, with the citizens starting to wake, I can imagine we aren't at war. Morning had begun to whiten the sky. The air tasted like dew and cinnamon. I overheard the other planeswalkers saying that you're immune to Phyrexian influence.
Yes.
This means that you may be the only planeswalker who can be trusted. Sten's sable mantle beaded with water. You aren't the only one who can read signs of invasion. King Darien has tasked me with discovering Phyrexian agents. Obviously, this is not common knowledge.
What will you do after you discover such an agent?
Karn asked. What must be done, Sten said. The only thing that can be done. Once someone is completed, they are lost, whether they know it or not.
They don't know themselves?
No, Sten said. I think they are more useful to the Phyrexians, and harder to discover, if they themselves do not know. It made sense that those forced to act against their own interests, their families, and their very plane, would be kept oblivious of their own actions. The Phyrexians had to be inserting these unknowing sleeper agents everywhere. Yet to kill such people who had already been so wronged, King Darien must have selected Sten for his ruthlessness.
Have you ever caught such an agent?
Karn asked. No, not yet. Sten gazed at the dawn-glazed sea. Fishing boats skidded along the waves, tan sails belling. Defari's news frightened them. Karn nodded.
They should be frightened. Do you think Benalia and Keld will unify?
I don't know, Sten admitted. But I do know that I can promise this. New Argive will mobilize. We will stand with you in defense of Dominaria. Karn nodded, relieved that someone had taken him as a credible source. He had found his first ally willing to promote willing to provide military support.
We can discuss the details later.
In town, few seemed wakeful. Only bakers tucking yeasty loaves into ovens and children milking goats and feeding chickens. Sometimes Karn imagined their pains, losing a pet rooster to the dining table, spilling a much-needed bucket of milk. Long after these people had died, Karn would continue to ponder their lives. He felt old and tired, and the children's beautiful brevity seemed an unbearable tragedy in this still morning. When Karn reached the city hall, Ajani was awake, pacing between banks of ropey wisteria vines. Ajani paused, his body quivering with tension and his tail lashed once. Karn suspected this was not a voluntary gesture. He had seen how the Leonin seemed to smother his non-human mannerisms when near humans. Ajani's blue eye caught the light in the dimness, pupil glinting a predator's green.
Karn, do you think the humans are awake yet? Ajani asked. Joda and Jayad will sit the representatives down at the negotiation table once more today.
Karn could summon no patience for how Joda continued to prioritize this small human conflict before the Phyrexian threat.
Some are. I encountered Sten this morning, and he has pledged new Argive's forces.
Then let us speak to Jaya, Ajani said, before negotiations recommence. Question to self, how much longer is this? Not that much longer. You two could be much more compassionate toward me right now if you had heard of this substance called caffeine, Jaya muttered.
I have heard of it,
Karn said.
It is vile,
Ajani said. Teferi entered the room and opened the doors to the balcony. The chilly sea breeze finished the room. Oh my god, one story seems to be my comprehensive limit. The chilly sea breeze freshened the room, bringing with it springtime's rising bird song. A seagull landed on the balcony and cocked its head, looking at Teferi's bread roll in a meaningful way. A varied thrush landed on the wall, then jumped along it. Could it be the same bird as yesterday? How could such a shy woodland bird with its orange breast tolerate a seagull?
It isn't important who can change what taxes at which border, Ajani said. We should be prioritizing the fight against the Phyrexians. Correct.
Karn eyed the thrush.
And keeping the Silex from Phyrexian hands.
Silex? Ajani started. You have it with you?
I had it in my possession, Karn said, as I plan to deploy it on New Phyrexia and eradicate the Phyrexians' threat at its source. Once I determined its workings.
Karn, we agreed to handle that together. You can't go there alone, Teferi said, serious. You said yourself that we wait. Excuse me.
You said yourself that we waited too long. All of you promised me your help, and then you told me to be patient. No longer,
said Karn. The thrush was not even pretending to peck at invisible crumbs. Karn seized the bird.
I know what you are.
Karn, Jaya said. The bird's chest peeled open and cables shot out. The cables, slick with blood and slime, wrapped themselves around Karn's head. Goo slipped down his skin, and a maw at the tentacle's core searched along Ajani's cheek for purchase. Its teeth scraping down the smooth metal, Karn readjusted his grip around the creature's slippery body, trying to pull it from his face. But its wires had wrapped all the way around his head, locking together in a thick tangle at the nape of his neck. The creature's teeth caught on Karn's lip. It jabbed needle-like protuberances into him, like it wanted to inject him with some substance, and the needle snapped. It's too close to Karn, Jaya shouted. I can't blast it.
Let me,
Ajani said. Slime sloughed off the creature and sizzled on Karn's skin, corroding his metal. It hurt. The creature snaked its tentacles between the joints on Karn's neck and around his collar, as if trying to prise him apart. Karn grunted and squeezed his fingers between the creature's slippery body and his face. He forced it off him, flinging it across the room where it smacked against the opposite wall and slid down. the creature caterpillar crawled toward the door. Teferi raised his hands, slowing the creature within a blurring field to prevent its rapid escape. Ajani lunged forward and pierced the creature with his claws, pinning it to the floor. It shrieked and writhed. Acid spurted from the wound. Karn, face still steaming from the creature's corrosive slime, held out both hands, one over the other. He generated a bird cage, building it upwards until the bars united into a dome. Ajani ripped the monstrosity from the floor and flung it into the cage. It rattled the bars, screeching. Jaya crossed her arms. Turns out Joda has bigger things to worry about than taxes. Karn placed the Phyrexian bird on the granite negotiation table. Joda leaned toward it. His eyes widening, the creature in the cage hissed at him. Aaron Compassion looked sick. His Benalish knights had not moved, their discipline ironclad. Rada stared at it, eyes glittering. Her warriors had broken out into muttered prayers. Sten's lips had thinned in satisfaction that his point was made. They're here, Joda muttered. Among us. I told you, Sten said. Excuse me. Three of the Benalish knights exploded outward from their armor. Their eyes burst open in a shower of glistening black oil, and their jaws distended, metal teeth emerging from their flesh to stud their gaping maws. Metallic fibers wriggled out from between the gaps in their armor. One of the creatures swung toward the granite table, his clawed hands drawn together in a double fist. It slammed its hand down on the granite table, cracking it in two. The negotiations are over, it said. Its comrade seized Aaron with its writhing tentacles, bundling him up like a spider would a fly. Karn strode forward, Teferi and Ajani flanking him. Jaya held up her hands, summoning fire into her palms. Joda gathered energy, distorting the air around him with ribbons of color and then solidifying it into a force field to protect the unchanged Benalish soldiers from the Phyrexians. So, I'm sorry, what? 3 of the Benalish knights. Okay. For Gerard! One woman bellowed, lifting her sword. She dodged past Joda's barrier and to charge her ex-comrades. The Phyrexian knight avoided her blow by splitting itself in two. It slid apart into 2 meaty pieces, legs sprouting from what had once been glistening internal organs. Both halves attacked. The first wind of ascension is a forger, Rada called, backing toward the door. She, like Aaron, had come to the negotiation table unarmed. Burning away impurity, her warriors bellowed, forming up around her to protect her. They fought off the lashing tentacles that reached to seize her, chopping off the Phyrexian's limbs, but any appendage that hit the ground seemed to gain life of its own, sprouting legs and teeth, squirming toward the retreating Keldans. The Argivians fell back, joining the Keldans, fighting with their rapiers, the weapons of nobles who had never seen battle, and never expected to. Sten himself only wielded a dagger. Separated from his people, he backed away between the shards of the broken table until he reached Jaya's wreath of protective flame. Karn had almost reached Aaron. The Phyrexian holding him released a low laugh like an opening steam valve. It rolled its body around Aaron and bounded onto a neighboring balcony. Ajani snarled with frustration and launched himself after it. Ajani! Karn could not follow. The balconies would break under his weight if he tried to leap after light-footed Ajani. Karn made a noise low in his chest with frustration and took a step back. Teferi cursed. I can't jump that distance, Teferi said. The Keldans had reached the door. I do not wish to leave you, Archmage, Rada shouted. Keld stands with Dominaria, for Dominarians. We will battle this blasphemy alongside you to defend all peoples. Go, Joda shouted. We will fight together another day. There are too many of them, Karn said. Blockade them in this room. Rada nodded once. The brass double doors slammed shut, locking the planeswalkers and the mage into the room with the Phyrexians. Jaya swirled her hands up and around, blocking off the Phyrexians from Joda, protecting him. Her flame burned white with a vicious heat. Karn had no doubt that Jaya's magic could defeat even this. He pushed himself through the heat. It seared the tentacles trying to wriggle into the joints of his body, ending them. Much as I'd love to do this all day, Jaya said, throwing a fireball at a writhing hunk of metal and flesh. Joda? I've summoned the energy. Joda's eyes were aglow with it, his skin incandescent. But I need to know where to direct it to create the portal. A secure location. Argivia, Sten gasped. He flicked a piece of tentacle off him with his blade and stomped on it. Blood and oil spurted beneath his boot, and he turned toward the next encroaching tentacle and speared it through. New Argive's watchtower.
It is as safe a place as any.
Karn retreated toward Joda, Teferi at his side. Joda's portal spun into existence behind him. It opened like a doorway cut into the air itself, revealing a small circular room. Joda retreated through it to sustain it from the other side. I'll hold them off, Jaya said, searing the writhing cables with her fire. If you can get through the portal, I'll blast this room with such fire that not a single piece of Phyrexian will remain. Go! My thanks, Sten said. He backed through the portal as well. And mine as well, Teferi said, and vanished through the whirling vortex. Jaya grinned in triumph as she raised her hands in a blaze of fire and set the whole room alight. The screams of the Phyrexians, wet and unnatural, whistled. I think we're almost done. Karn stepped through the portal. The magic tingled across his skin and swallowed him, depositing him on the other side. A shape, airborne, flicked past him. Karn turned to search for it. He couldn't see any movement in the small room but for those who had arrived with him. Sten, Joda, Jaya, Teferi, and himself. Jaya, last through the portal, joined Karn at his side. Joda closed the portal and collapsed, sagging to the ground. Transporting so many people was no easy feat, even for Joda. The humans all sat on the floor, sweating, panting, and bleeding, while Karn remained standing. He searched the room for the flickering shadow. The tower room had tiny arched windows ringing it, and it was empty but for a pedestal in the center, which seemed to have a control panel on it. Overhead, a golden light shimmered through a crystal. No, not a crystal. A power stone. A shadow flitted across the power stone's face.
One followed us,
Karn said. We must not let it escape. It could wreak havoc in our city. Sten flipped a toggle in the central control panel. The watchtower thumped as gears ground to life. The wall's interiors echoed with the rattle of moving chains. Steel shutters and blast doors slammed shut, blocking out all light. The room instantly felt stuffier, more claustrophobic. Sten handed Karn the key. You are the only one who's incorruptible, so it's only right that you have it. Jaya bumped her shoulders into Joda's. You never get tired of being right, do you? The millennia may wear on, but no, I do not. Joda's smile faded, and he turned to Karn. Nothing, and no one may leave while the tower is in lockdown, Sten said. Teferi eyed the steeled shutters. We must capture and destroy the Phyrexian trapped here, and we must determine if any among us has been compromised. We need to know who we can trust before we can plan how to defeat them. Agreed, Joda said. The group checked the room. The small Phyrexian thing that had come with them had escaped the chamber. Karn surmised it must have squirreled itself away through some crack in the stone. He strung the key from the same chain he used to hang the scryer and the beacon to summon the weatherlight and turned to face his companions. A frisson of unease traveled through his body, as if an electric current arced through him. Joda, Jaya, Teferi, Sten? How could he determine who he could trust? If the Phyrexians were already on Dominaria, who could anyone trust?
Whew.
Okay. Oh, it was intense. Oh boy. My brain is tired. I'm glad it takes almost exactly an hour to read through each of these.